Harold, and welcome back to another episode of More Than Kurosawa. And this week, we're going to be looking at the film Woman in the Dunes by director Hiroshi Teshigahara. This is one of the most acclaimed movies of all time, really, particularly in international cinema, up there in the top 100 in Letterboxd. So not only one of the most acclaimed Asian movies of all time, but one of the most acclaimed movies of all time. So I'm excited to do a deep dive into this movie, what I got from it, and what makes Teshigahara really special as a filmmaker. But if you're new to this series, what I do every single week and have been for these past, 20 or so weeks now, is reviewing a different Asian movie by a different Asian director to help us understand the wide world of Asian cinema, to help us color in all the different aspects of Asian cinema, because we're trying to go a little bit deeper. I think for a lot of us, well, a lot of my audience, including myself, is a Western audience, so when we watch international cinema, we kind of get the highlights, see maybe some Kurosawa movies, maybe some contemporaries, your Bong Joon-ho's, your Hayao Miyazaki's, but there are so many great filmmakers and with so many great movies, so that's what we're trying to do here on this series. Showcase filmmakers from different countries, oftentimes many different genres, and I think Teshigahara is another kind of a different type of filmmaker that we haven't covered yet, and I wanted to highlight him and some of his amazing works. But you guys have been showing a lot of support for these videos, showing up and watching them, liking the videos. That's always really helpful. But if you'd like to, give your own thoughts on the videos, please, comment down below. I'd love to hear your feedback. We're definitely starting to ramp up at the end of this series now, probably a month or so left of these videos until we get into the Oscar season and fall film festivals and stuff like that for Old's Oscar Countdown. That's coming down the line. Still got kind of a couple months left of this series. So if you are appreciating it, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, or feel free to check out some of my other videos in this series, because we have a full kind of a syllabus right now, I think, of great Asian movies that you can go back and check out. And that's the benefit of these videos too, is that the videos, the movies that I recommend in every video are good starter movies. If you haven't heard of the filmmaker, they usually are picked to be a great introductory point, as well as maybe being representative of the director's entire career, so you can get a better understanding. If you haven't seen this movie, if you haven't seen the movies of Teshigahara, this is definitely maybe a good opportunity and a good starting point to learn a little bit more. But speaking of which, how we've been structuring these videos, the first half is talking about why I think the filmmaker is special, why I wanted to cover the filmmaker in particular, and then the second half of the video talk about the film what we're covering today and what I took away from it ultimately. But jumping into why I wanted to cover Teshigahara here on this series, and I mentioned it before, but he is the first experimental filmmaker, the first kind of art filmmaker that we've covered on this channel. We want to cover different filmmakers from different countries, yes, but also different genres. So we can cover Johnny To last week, which does a lot of, say, crime movies, but then we can also cover more personal dramas, let's say in the case of Hirokazu Koreeda that we've covered in the past. All different types of genres, all different types of filmmakers with different stylistic approaches. And yet we still, 20 plus weeks into the series, still haven't covered kind of an experimental filmmaker or an art filmmaker. And that's mostly just because I don't always resonate with these kinds of movies. I had considered even a filmmaker like Edward Yang or a Pichapong Weerasethakul, filmmakers who are maybe more associated with like slow cinema, particularly like Thai directors, which I would also kind of be more aligned to calling art cinema or experimental cinema. More so, I guess, art cinema in the case of slow cinema, just because it feels a little bit more at home with a museum piece than it is, let's say, a blockbuster. And I don't always resonate with those movies, which is why those types of movies haven't been covered on this channel, because I didn't want to cover something that I didn't feel really passionately about. But a good movie is a good movie, and I still, checked out the films of Pichapong Weerasethakul just to see if they were eligible for this channel. And also, I checked out the films of Teshigahara because I wasn't sure if I would really resonate with him as a filmmaker, and I'm glad to say that I really did, and that's why we're covering him on this channel, because like I said, a good movie is a good movie. And I think as a film fan, even if you don't like, let's say, horror movies or dramas or something like that, you can always kind of appreciate when one is really well made. And I think that's the case of a few of Teshigahara's films here. Pitfall, Woman in the Dunes, The Face of Another, some really interesting movies. But what I think is the reason I engage with this movie, and I think why his more art films are more easily accessible to a mainstream audience, is how entertaining and how high concept their stories are. There's always this kind of a through line of, if you were to define his movies, a kind of surrealist drama or surrealist thriller. There is an entertainment factor to the story. It's more so how Teshigahara shoots the film or edits the film that makes it a little bit more experimental. And then there's certain things that were experimental at the time that have actually aged quite well because they're less experimental. Things like, very intense handheld cameras, close-ups, kind of non-linear editing, things like that, which have become a little bit more traditional in even modern blockbusters. And if I were to compare him with, say, a more modern Western filmmaker, I think it would be someone like a Terrence Malick, who I love his movies, but I love Badlands and The Thin Red Line and even something like A Hidden Life. Whereas with Terrence Malick's movies, if you've seen them, there is a kind of rhythmic, spiritual nature to the movies that feel poetic. But with it, the movies that I've connected with Malick's is there's always a semblance of a story. In the case of A Hidden Life, let's say, a man not wanting to go to war, or in the case of Thin Red Line, there's like a battle that's going on. We have to get to the top of this hill. Very simple kind of basics of a story. Whereas some of Malick's movies like Song to Song or Tree of Life that are a little bit more expansive and unwieldy, they're a little bit harder for me to resonate with. And I feel the same here with Teshigahara's movies, where I like The Face of Another or Woman in the Dunes a lot because there still is a really interesting, entertaining thriller drama that is underlined there, but there's still an engagement in terms of how interested you are in the story, let's say, for example. But in order to properly talk about Teshigahara, you have to talk about his frequent collaborator, Kobe Abe, who is a Japanese novelist who wrote 4 films with Teshigahara and 1 short, 3 of which were based on Abe's own novels. There's a really a deep collaboration where I think if you think of Teshigahara's, all of his best movies, Pitfall, The Face of Another, The Man Without a Map, Woman in the Dunes that we're covering today, they're all, connected there to Kobe Abe. And I think that's notable. Certain filmmakers, they have frequent collaborators. Let's say Martin Scorsese, he switches up his actors, his cinematographers, but he always kind of relies on his editor in Thelma Schoonmaker. We talked about Juzo Otami, who has kind of a recurring cast of actors that he uses. But in the case of Teshigahara, it really is the writing, and the writer, in this case of Kobe Abe. And they're a great match because Abe brings this interesting what-if story in many ways. What if a guy loses his face, or what if a guy gets trapped into these dunes, or what have you. And then that makes the bones and the structure of a really interesting story. And I think Teshigahara brings a lot of the kind of larger thematic metaphors and experimental style within the filmmaking that makes the movie experimental. But still, I think leans into the surrealist elements of Abe's work. And then speaking about that experimental part a little bit more specifically, I mentioned earlier handheld camera, shooting outdoors. That was a little bit more experimental in the 60s. But more so, I think, with his editing, he's more experimental, where in the case of The Face of Another, we'll have a completely different storyline kind of interspersed within our main storyline of this woman who only has half of her face burnt, and we see how that, I think, adds to the themes of the story of scars that you can't kind of avoid, and national scars in the case of Japan and their connection with the atomic bomb. And then I think also in something like Woman in the Dunes, or even a movie like Pitfall, he'll use editing in a non-linear way, but also in a time-jumping way where it's unclear how much time has passed and not revealed until later, so you feel a little bit disoriented. I think purposefully in his movies sometimes. That's what I mean more so in terms of experimental storylines that make no sense or are completely unrelated to the main storyline that we're covering, that are interspersed to add thematic reasons, or just playing around with the editing so that you're not totally aware of what day we are in and we're in a moving of a kind of linear story. It kind of bounces over a bit, but I think that adds to the surreality of the kind of beautiful compositions that he's able to make, the themes of the stories that we'll talk about a little bit later, but really just his approach to making unique, different movies, ultimately Teshigahara is a filmmaker that doesn't necessarily work in different genres because there are so many genres within his own movie. They're very singular, they're very unique, but he makes ultimately these entertaining dramas and thrillers that also have some interesting thematic, larger themes that aren't necessarily directly told to you, but are told via metaphor, via composition, and via kind of the unique editing patterns that he employs. But speaking about the movie we are covering today, 1964's Woman in the Dunes, it is about a teacher from Tokyo who uses his holiday, uses his vacation to go to a desert to research bugs and to try to find these interesting bugs, who gets conned into living with this woman and digging sand for these people above. He gets trapped into this dune with one ladder in and no way out, as he's kind of forced to shovel the sand and bring it back up to these people. We don't know necessarily why they want it or what's valuable about it, but he essentially gets kidnapped and conned into this kind of life of enslavement. And it's a very, very entertaining movie, plays like a kind of trapped, all-in-one-place thriller in the same way 10 Cloverfield Lane does that, or you could even say like Trap most recently in a certain aspect of which is a really entertaining thriller. And I think that was really what impressed me the most, was just the kind of basics of the story. The twists, the storytelling, the tension, the different ways he tries to escape. It always keeps you engaged on that sense. And I think if you were to remake it, if let's say M. Night Shyamalan remade it, it would still be a really entertaining and engaging thriller that I would definitely check out. But it's not just that. It's also a movie that is a key text to understanding, I think, a lot of Teshigahara's themes of identity. And that's what I really find when I watch a lot of his movies. That word kind of came to mind. It's like identity, who you are, and how you can reshape yourself after a big event. So in the case of this, it's after you've been kidnapped. In the case of Pitfall, it's after you've lost your job and you're looking for work. In the case of The Face of Another, what happens when you completely lose your face and you feel like a new person. And the way kind of society or outside factors can help shape and affect the way you view things. I think it's directly kind of analyzed in a movie like The Face of Another, a little bit more subtly and metaphorically in the case of Woman in the Dunes, but it's still equally as there. I think what's so great about Woman in the Dunes in particular is that it is still an art film, in that there's a lot of metaphor, so that you can interpret it in many different ways, which is why I think it is a great art film. You know, I take certain things away from it that you may take away something different, and there isn't a kind of right or wrong way of viewing things. It's just this kind of Twilight Zone almost story. This man gets trapped into this dune, no way out, he has to live with this woman, and then we see all these kind of the dynamics that are on play, and the way you kind of interpret those dynamics, the events of the film, I think can be telling to how you view things. And what's so great about it, I think, is that you can take so many different things away from it. Now, of course, detractors may say, well, then it has no meaning, no message, but I do think there is still enough kind of metaphorical elements of themes and events that can be, you know, extracted and understood. I know for me personally, I kind of saw it as I mentioned that loss of identity, in particular how a person, in this case a man's individuality and freedom, when you kind of stifle that and force it to do one thing, numbs the soul or destroys the soul, and how kind of outside maybe bureaucratic forces, people who can control someone's life through, let's say, a society or through a job or what have you, if they're not doing what they want to be doing, can be this really kind of soul-crushing experience and destroy someone's kind of entire mind and personality and freedom and identity, and lose themselves. Oftentimes in the film we hear the teacher say he's a teacher, he's a respected teacher, that they'll find that is so much part of his identity. And then as the movie goes on and people aren't finding him and he's there longer and longer, he forgets that he's a teacher and he's just worried about survival, and he almost goes back to kind of a hard reset of his humanity. The movie also becomes a lot more erotic in that stage, a lot more animalistic as well. Teshigahara uses the eroticism, I think, as a comment on when you reduce someone from their individuality and their personality into more animalistic aspects, that's something that maybe arises Still, though, making the scenes erotic by using intense close-ups, lots of handheld cameras, makes you feel like you're kind of with them in the dune, adding into that, with these intense close-ups, adding to the claustrophobic nature of the story, which I think adds to the thriller and the kind of tension of the movie. So it uses sex as both a way to increase the tension of the movie, but also I think comment on the themes. That's maybe a good example of the balance of it being still an interesting thriller. You want to see how this guy gets out of this dune, or if he can get out of this dune, and then also commenting a little bit more about the state of someone when they lose their identity. So if you want to check out a really entertaining thriller that is also a kind of real-time destruction of a man's soul and loss of identity, I think they work on both ends. Really interesting score, really interesting cinematography, composition within the movie. It really is a movie as you watch where you go, oh, I get why it's so celebrated, so acclaimed. Because you can watch it when you're 17 and be entertained, and then when you're older and you've maybe seen it a couple more times, you can be a little bit more interpretive in terms of what the story is trying to tell you, and kind of dissect some of the scenes that are going on. It is a long movie, but it is a rich piece of text. It's a rich piece of filmmaking with a lot on its mind and a lot that it has to offer for you. So whether you get it as an entertaining thriller or you get it as a metaphorical movie about the destruction of a man's soul and his identity, I think it works on both levels, and definitely comes highly recommended by me as another example that when it comes to Asian cinema, there is more than Kurosawa. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on the movie, if you've seen it, on Teshigahara as a filmmaker, and if there's any other filmmakers you'd like me to cover in the future. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.